this webinar, we're going to explore how to build a new research infrastructure, an RI, from the perspectives of the local, national and international levels. To explore this topic, we are talking to Ivan Baines, Chief Operating Officer and Board Member of the Max Planck Institute for Molecular Cell Biology and Genetics, the MPI-CBG. Thank you, Ivan, for sharing your extensive knowledge and experience of this topic. To put our conversation into some context, perhaps you could talk us through your career and your role as Chief Operating Officer at the Max Planck Institute.
Sure, Claire. First of all, thanks very much for the invitation. It's good to be here. As Chief Operating Officer, short answer is I'm responsible for the day-to-day operations of the Research Institute. It's a basic research institute investigating molecular cell biology at the border with developmental genetics. My preferred answer is to say that as a COO, I'm responsible for providing the optimal environment to perform research. How often is a leading scientist recruited and then starved of accessing the technologies and infrastructure that they need to succeed?
Could you outline the main steps to be taken in planning a new research infrastructure?
Sure, yeah. I think the two critical things to consider are the purpose of the RI and the intent of the RI, and they're not exactly the same thing. The purpose is its scientific or technical reason for being developed. The intent may be the motivation of the funders or the region or the governmental officers for providing it. In other words, it may be that, so the purpose could be to provide human MRI to a community of clinical researchers. The intent may be to make that affordable from the funder's perspective. So one has to go through a consultative process to make sure that all of the stakeholders' agendas have been considered when basically designing the RI.
That's a nice clarification between the purpose and the intent. So what are the main issues in setting up a research infrastructure?
Well, I think that because they are serving a broader community, you have to find a product or a range of services which has a broad enough attractiveness or need among the community to justify building something in a central way. Then merging or finding the sort of center of a Venn diagram of the different stakeholder interests can be quite a challenge. Just to illustrate that, a strategic stakeholder could be an institute director that wants to push to increase the level of technology, if you like, the state of art of the technology which is being used. For example, if it's microscopy, they may want you to use the latest Bessel beam microscope from the Nobel laureate Bretzig. From the perspective of the user, what they want is just something to get their answer in a convenient way, and often they're more governed by familiarity. So even the user community has different interests, and so you have to go through an extensive consultative process to define the agendas of each of the different user groups, the community, and arrive at a common agenda. And that's really the major challenge.
And if a research infrastructure is being built at the regional level or national or international, will have different implications for how it's set up. Could you kind of explain the differences that?
Absolutely. No, you're entirely correct. So with regard to the purpose is, or should be, a scientific purpose, and so it should not be subject to whether it's regional, national, or international to the same extent. On the other hand, the intent becomes very important because, of course, whether it's funded at the regional level, at the national level, or international level has a huge impact on what the agenda is with regard to intent. For example, typically regional RIs are to promote the competitiveness and the regional economy. National RIs could be to provide in the most affordable way access to that nation's community that's relevant to particular RI, to provide access to that technology to the nation's community. It may also be considered to how it will drive the nation's economy, or more clearly defined, that nation's innovation potential. So now at the international level, it generally is no longer a single nation's economy or a single nation's agenda. They typically are addressing grand challenges where a single nation does not feel enabled or hasn't the financial means to address a question on their own. It could be a big telescope or a synchrotron or something which is beyond the means of a single nation to support.
And what would you say are the main challenges in planning and setting up a research infrastructure?
Well, first of all, you have to make sure that you are at the state of the art with regard to excellence. So if it isn't excellent, it's not enabling research at the current state of the art. So that's a requirement. Careful consideration must be given to capacity versus utilization. Okay, capacity, these are often confused. Many RIs are planned with regard to their theoretical output, which is their maximum capacity. It's not, on the other hand, they won't ever be used at that capacity. Typically, instruments require maintenance, staff requiring training. There will be downtime, and there will be time that is not utilized to deliver a service. So typically, utilization is a significant fraction of the total capacity. So one must consider capacity versus utilization. And finally, one has to do an in-depth scientific and technical due diligence to find out, to address feasibility. Is it reasonable, is it feasible for an RI to deliver the scope of services or scientific opportunity that is expected of it? One would have thought that is obvious, but it is often overlooked that what's actually expected is beyond the capacity of an RI to deliver to the community that is interested in accessing that RI.
So it's really kind of a reality check, actually.
Absolutely, yeah, a reality check is essential. I mean, maybe just to give you an example, in terms of S3 programs, there's the bioinformatics S3, which is Elixir. I think bioinformatics is one of the area which is most frequently, the expectations are out of whack with the reality. So if you like, bioinformatics, it's sort of like the Renaissance. It used to be that science was philosophy. So a philosopher would cover maths, chemistry, physics. Now a bioinformatician is expected to cover everything from statistics to traditional phylogeny searches, ortholog searches, protein structural prediction, interactive databases, software design, basically anything that a biologist feels uncomfortable to do themselves. So when you go around, you find many institutes may complain that their bioinformatics infrastructure is too slow and doesn't deliver. When you look at it, you find out that the expectations are completely unreasonable. You have 5 bioinformaticians supporting 2,000 scientists, and this is just not reasonable. So you have to align expectations and make sure that there is a reality check.
So previously you've been involved with the National Institutes of Health in the US in the small business innovation research. And you advised on the startup of, I think, more than 100 organisations. So that obviously would bring a lot of experience in kind of setting up these research organisations. So what did you learn from that you've been able to apply to setting up research infrastructures?
Well, actually, it's the activity that I find most rewarding and also most fun. It's basically it is consulting with the players, the key players, the stakeholders, to try and find out from first principles what is the goal, what is the intent, and then from an understanding of what the intent is, both from a scientific or technical perspective, but also with regard to startups. There's a business agenda, of course, profitability, and to try and really define what are those key considerations, and then to design an organizational and operational and financial model that embraces those goals. And I find that, so for every little startup, whether it's someone in their garage with a nice little prototype, or someone who has a grand idea of opening a diagnostics institution for thousands of patients, everyone requires going through some consultative process, understanding needs, and then defining something that addresses those needs. Never is it the case that one size fits all. So you have to come with an open mind, with experience of what are the critical ingredients and considerations, and then go through a process to define those needs and match them to a structure or a model.
And moving from the planning to construction stage, what are the main tasks and roles of a research infrastructure manager?
So, well, of course, they have to define the range of products and services that the RI will deliver. So in this regard, they have to consult with their user community. Very important to ask the right question. If they ask the user community, what should this RI do? They will get a lengthy answer, which will not mesh with reality and with the resources. So they have to go around and ask the users, what do you need personally for your research? And so they then, if you gather those needs, you find that in fact, you design your Venn diagram. Each user has a particular set of needs, and a certain proportion of those needs turn out to be the same needs as other researchers in that community. And that defines the center of the Venn diagram, and that's where you build your RI, because that's really then supporting the users. If you're building an RI and it serves one user, it's probably not the right model.
Could you provide an example of a major challenge you faced in setting up a research infrastructure?
I would like to answer that question, I'd like to go back to the start of the MPI-CBG in Dresden. We wanted to try a different model. It was called the Dresden model because we were setting up in Dresden. And the idea was to have smaller research groups and all the technologies in centralized infrastructure. We call them the services facilities, you could call them core facilities. These were being made available to the researchers on a recharge basis. This was counterculture. This is in 2000, 2001. So at that time, researchers were not used to paying to access technologies in their own institute. So they complained loudly. They said, we were recruited, we were never told we'd have to pay to use a microscope. So then I had to persuade them that, in fact, we had, as an institute, we had two options. We can either finance the technology platforms directly, and then they can do whatever they want. They do not have to serve you, the research group leader. Or we can give you, the research group leader, the money, and then recharge the access to that technology platform to a special dedicated budget, which we have given to you. In essence, all the money is coming from the funder anyway. It's not really your own money anyway. So it's just a question of whether we fund directly or indirectly. If we fund indirectly, it means that the technology platform has to consider you, the customer, and they have to deliver to you. So it creates a healthy dynamic between the user and the provider. So it was a massive challenge. It took a few years to properly establish that culture. The other aspect was that the group leader said, well, if I'm paying, I don't have to put that person on my paper as an author because I'm paying for their service. And then you had to explain, well, really never has the source of money defined whether an intellectual contribution justifies authorship. There is a standard in the community that if you make an intellectual input, then you've earned the right to authorship. Where the money comes from doesn't impact that. So you have to continually explain both those aspects. One, that we are creating a healthy dynamic between user and provider, and two, that this doesn't compromise the type of intellectual input that's provided. And eventually, people embrace it. I think now, with regard to the MPI-CBG, the availability of these services and facility was cited as most often as the reason why it was voted in the Scientist magazine the best place to do a postdoc. And it was also voted to be the best academic environment. And the reason was that the postdocs, pre-docs felt empowered because they could access the technology platforms themselves. So rather than just having however many shots on goals as the number of research groups you have the number of shots on goal as the number of projects or postdocs or pre-docs. So it's a huge increase in the impact that you can have.
So really that's making changes in the culture and showing the benefits.
Exactly.
And keep persisting as well.
Yes. And I must say, when I go to other institutes where it hasn't been done, I often forget the importance of nurturing that cultural shift, because I take it for granted now, as of the institution where I work, those things are now established.
What role does innovation play in running a research infrastructure, and what does innovation mean to a research infrastructure manager like yourself?
Well, innovation is an important ingredient in many things we do. So to an RA manager, it may be a critical ingredient for them to be competitive to get a grant application, for example. But now, of course, innovation can be a new technology, a new invention, a new service. So it could be enabling research in that regard, but it can also be a new model, a new process. So it could be an improved financial model, it could be an improved operational model, so one could have an innovative new way of delivering microscopy, or an innovative way of providing biobanks. So it could be either the mechanism or it could be the content. And I think one has to keep on top of both. One absolutely must be innovative with regard to the technology. It has to be state of the art. So innovation is required there, but it can also be important in terms of the model. Certain aspects of RIs must also be more routine, because they're delivering a defined service to a larger community. So you see, there is an interesting dynamic. Whilst certain aspects of technology are routine, there are other aspects which are clearly state-of-the-art, at the leading edge, and innovative. And in fact, an RI must have that leading-edge component too, otherwise it won't be attractive.
So a research infrastructure is kind of very different from just setting up a research organisation. So are there any other additional kind of aspects that you'd like to share that we haven't already covered?
So I think one of the hardest things is that often RIs are set up appended to leading research groups. So in other words, you think if you're looking for the latest in a particular type of microscopy, set up the RI appended to that leading microscopist or the leading DNA sequencing expert. In fact, it's critical to have a separation between the provider of the RI and the research group. If a research group is put in charge of providing a technology of the RI, eventually the RI becomes annexed to their activities, and it's not necessarily fully and equally accessible to everybody. An RI has to be equally accessible to everybody. If it's appended to a research lab, it won't be. So that means that, in fact, often research institutes want to put their group leaders in charge of their technology platforms, or they want to have a user committee that is supervising the technology platforms. This doesn't actually work. You need to have the RI manager chair the user committee, because then they are accountable for the recommendations actually being followed from their user committee. If they're not chairing it, they can sit, and they don't necessarily have to actually respond to those requests. Even more importantly, the PI or the leading research in the technology mustn't have that RI appended to their group, because they will be the major user. They will gradually occupy more and more of the capacity of the RI. It won't be properly recharged or costed, so it will make it uneconomical for others to access, because in effect they're subsidizing this group's research activities. And it won't be fully transparent with regard to costs and capacity and so on, and will not be successful in my experience. So very important to have a separation of the managers running RIs and the PIs and scientists performing research.
I think that's a really nice point to bring out. Could you summarise the key learning points that we've been through in the webinar?
So I think first and foremost, you must arrive at a common agenda between all your stakeholders. The common agenda needs to address both purpose and intent of the RI, which are not the same thing. The purpose is mainly scientific or technological, and the intent is what is expected from the funders or the community. Then one needs to give careful consideration to capacity versus utilization. The capacity is the maximal theoretical output of the RI, which is never achieved. So if you cost it on the basis of capacity, it will be disappointing to the funders, because it will cost a lot more. So utilization is the percentage of the capacity that is realistic to actually deliver. Scientific and technical excellence. Every RI must operate at the current state of the art, otherwise it won't be attractive to the users. You have to give very careful consideration to sustainability, because typically RIs are set up and equipped all at one time. That means all the equipment is going to age in the same time frame and will all need to be replaced at the same time. Whereas you can secure funds to get the equipment in the first cycle, getting funds again to replace all that equipment is incredibly difficult. So one has to give thought already to the equipment life cycle at the beginning of setting up the RI and have a plan. Either it has to be provided or purchased again by the funders, or the recharge must provide enough means to replace it themselves. So I think, and then finally, it's the financial model. So to make sure that the financial model is linked in a defined way to the product or to the services in a one-to-one. If that's the case, then the RI will succeed. Finally, I think it's important to say that when RIs this is one of the major challenges, RIs take a few years typically to ramp up. So as they're ramping up, you cannot charge the first person who buys an apple the cost of the apple orchard. So that means someone has to be underwriting the costs until you achieve a certain number of users. So that is, I'd say, are the key points.
Yeah, and that finishes a nice little analogy as well with their apple. Thank you very much, Ivan, for sharing your experience with us.
You're welcome, Claire. Thank you.